I was kidding. We're allowed to have this party.
That was trying to be at you.
That'll be at first. So we're herding cats in here anyway. So.
Pastor, do you want me to lock the door?
Sure. Well, no, because someone might straggle in.
Okay. I'll leave it open then.
Okay. People say pastor and I get confused. Who would like to pray us into this study?
I'll try.
Okay.
Thank God we come to you and thank you for this Bible study. And I pray that we can learn things from it and obtain that information. And that's all we would hear. Amen.
Nothing wrong with that. Isn't it funny that you talk about prayer as something you'll try to do? How can you goof up prayer?
I don't know. That's the same problem at home.
Even when you don't know what you're supposed to pray, the Spirit of God speaks for you, so it's all good. All right, we're going to look at chapters 10 and 11 this evening. We're going to do it in two parts, though, so that we aren't reading too far ahead before we start asking questions. So, anyone want to read verses 1 to 12 in chapter 10?
Okay. What sorrow awaits the unjust judges and those who issue unfair laws? They deprive the poor of justice, and they deny the rights of the needy among my people. They prey on widows and take advantage of orphans. What will you do when I punish you, when I send disaster upon you from a distant land? To whom will you turn for help? Where will your treasure be safe? You will stumble along as prisoners or lie among the dead. But even then the Lord's anger will not be satisfied. His fist is still poised to strike. What sorrow awaits Assyria, the rod of my anger? I use it as a club to express my anger. I am sending Assyria against a godless nation, against the people with whom I am angry. Assyria will plunder them, trampling them like dirt beneath its feet. But the king of Syria will not understand that he is my tool. His mind does not work that way. His plan is simply to destroy, to cut down nation after nation. He will say, each of my princes will soon be a king. We destroyed Calno just as we did
Carchemish.
Hamath fell before us as Arpad did. And we destroyed Samaria just as we did Damascus. Yes, we have finished off many a kingdom whose gods were greater than those in Jerusalem and Samaria. So we will defeat Jerusalem and her gods, just as we destroyed Samaria with hers.
Verse 12 also.
After the Lord has used the king of Assyria to accomplish his purposes on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, he will turn against the king of Assyria and punish him, for he is proud and arrogant, he boasts.
Yep. I had to read verse 12 because it sort of encapsulates the rest of the material there. What do the needy, the poor, the widows, and the fatherless have in common, and what then do they represent? What do they have in common?
They have no say.
How do you know that?
Because it says that they were withholding justice from the oppressed of my people, making widows their prey and robbing the fatherless.
Oh, I see. Okay, so because of the way they're being treated, they obviously don't have...
No say.
Okay, all right. That's actually a very good answer. It wasn't what I thought you were going to say, but good, yeah, excellent. What else would you want to say about them?
He must not have anything, because it says, loving the fatherless, that would be taking away probably the land or whatever they had, or even just everyday household. Loving the fatherless.
That's an interesting deduction, and it makes sense from what you read there. But I think there's a better way to understand it.
Well, it seems like they're making laws to do that.
They are making unjust laws to take advantage of people, absolutely. But let's go back to what do these people have in common, first of all. You were on the right track, and then you argued out from underneath yourself. What do widows, orphans, the poor, the needy, what do they have in common?
They have no real rights from anything. Not necessarily rights, but rights that are acknowledged, I guess you would say.
That would be true in an unjust society where it was made that way, and so certainly if they're decreeing unrighteous decrees, then it could end up that way. But there's a reason that these folks become victims. These are examples of people who do not have their own resources on which to live. The simplest example is the widow. The widow is properly considered a widow if she's beyond marriageable age, so she can't get married and have a man to provide sustenance for her, and if she has no surviving male relative that can take responsibility for her care. I don't know that it's quite that narrow in every case, but that's, I think, the easiest way to understand. In other words, they have no source of livelihood. So when we talk about the widow or the orphan's in the same position. The orphan has no family, land, or anything to draw on, so whether male or female, the orphan cannot care for him or herself. The needy would be a general category of anybody in that same basic plight. And the poor, of course, fall under the same heading. These are all people who have no way to care for themselves independently. To that, you might be able to say that in some cases they didn't have rights, but it would depend on the culture they were in. The primary issue is they can't take care of themselves in terms of food and clothing and shelter and so forth. We don't have a similar category of people that fall into a nice, neat, singular category, do we? And yet, I think we do have examples of people who can't take care of themselves for one reason or another. So even though maybe we can't say widows or we can't say orphans, we can talk about a category of people called the marginalized. These are people who, from a societal standpoint, are pushed to the edges of society and often are overlooked. Many of them are in that position because they do not have the resources to care for themselves. The homeless would be a marvelous example of this. Certainly you could include runaways and people like that. People who are victims of human trafficking. We have all kinds of pictures that go into this. It's just, biblically speaking, that's what these folks represent. They represent the people who are most vulnerable in society.
The people is it the Jewish people?
Well, in this case, God is speaking against the way the Jewish leaders have been treating these people, or this type of person. They've been taking advantage of them both legally and personally, so that God has to say, "Whoa, wait a minute! This is not the way my people are supposed to act." In a more general sense, God would say that about any culture, I think. But specifically, he's talking to his own people. So yeah, the Jewish leaders are decreeing unjust laws. They are robbing the needy of justice. In other words, they're probably taking bribes or just making decisions based on who can give them the best benefit themselves. Make widows their prey. When a person is utterly dependent on you, it's pretty easy to take advantage of them. Same with the fatherless. But that doesn't mean that these are the only types of people that are falling victim. It's just these people represent that larger category of those who get kind of shoved to the margins and who don't then have any real power to be recognized and acknowledged as valuable.
It used to be God-fearing people.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, it could be. You don't have to be.
Well, didn't the Jewish have some kind of a law or something about when they do their harvesting in that there, they have to leave so much?
The gleaning laws?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So these would be changing them, exactly.
Or ignoring them or changing them, yeah. Back in the 60s, one of the arguments that the civil rights leaders made was you have to disobey an unjust law. Because in our own culture, we have put laws on the books that are designed specifically to oppress, in one way or another, specific groups of people. Those are unjust laws. And we have an obligation as justice seekers to disobey those laws. Of course, the other side of that is you have to be willing to take the consequences of disobeying that unjust law. And so, somebody like Martin Luther King Jr. ends up in jail quite frequently. Why? Because he's disobeying unjust laws, among other things. But we have an obligation to do that. Here, God is speaking against those very kinds of things, unjust laws and unjust practices. So you look like you're munching on something over there. What are you thinking about? Well, you look like you were chewing.
Oh, okay, I'll stop chewing.
I want you to chew. I'm just wondering what it is you're working on.
Nothing. I was just thinking about way back in the, Martin Luther King days.
Now, what were you remembering?
Nothing. He got shot.
Oh, he certainly did get shot.
Yes.
Raises a big question, though. Why did he get shot? Just for anybody. Why did he get shot?
Hatred.
In general, but there's probably something more specific.
He overstepped what the majority of the people thought was, this is the law, this is the way it should be, and Martin Luther King said, no, it's got to be the same for everybody, or nobody. And a lot of white people said, no, I don't want that.
I think that is true. But I also suspect that when someone dies in that kind of situation, it has something to do with the perceived threat that they pose. Who would stand to lose the most if Martin Luther King Jr. had his way in that day? Who would stand to lose?
Actually, the white business people.
power people, people who have influence. Probably you could say many business people were included in that. But I think what we have to recognize is that it's the people who are the movers and shakers, the people who benefit from the laws that were keeping black people down. And, so when you have theories like, the assassination was, underwritten or sponsored by, a certain group of people, politicians or something, there may be some truth to that. I'm not trying to be a conspiracy theorist here. I'm just saying that these kinds of things generally don't come down to death unless there's a real perceived threat to the people who are benefiting from the status quo. Enough said.
Well, just one more question then. What would you say about Syrian that killed Robert Kennedy? Was he just trying to make a statement, or?
I think in that case, I'm not willing to answer because I don't know enough about Syrian to answer it. The simple fact is the Kennedys represented a threat to a certain group of people, probably a pretty broad group of people. Syrian, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what made him who he was.
Well, he was a Muslim, and he said the reason that he killed him was so that he couldn't come to power.
I'm reminded of something that a former superintendent told me. He said, when somebody comes to you and says they're mad at you and they tell you this is why they came, dig, because it's never for the thing they tell you. It's always something else. I suspect that's probably true in many, many, many cases. I don't know what his beef was. Maybe he was sponsored. Maybe he was persuaded to do it by somebody else. Maybe not. I don't know. Maybe it was a Muslim thing. I don't know. But the Kennedys were making inroads. And some people didn't like the roads they were coming in on. So, in what ways do you think these first 4 verses apply to our present day? And we've already sort of been working that direction, but let's talk 2021, almost 2022 here. What do these first lessons, the first 4 verses say about?
Well, like you said, the homeless, they're the same as the oppressed people. They just have no rights, or they get pushed around.
Is it fair to say that nearly every society has people in this kind of situation?
The poor are always among us, no matter where you go, I think.
Well, I think there are some tribal organizations where they've done a really good job of preventing people from falling through the cracks, but it's usually in a very small setting. But is it fair to say that societies generally have people who are easily oppressed in them?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. God's obviously mad at Israel and his people for not caring for these folks. In fact, one of the things that was common throughout the ancient Near East, so not just in Israel, but around the ancient Near East, kings had a stated special responsibility to care for the poor. Now, they didn't usually fulfill that all that well, but they were at least supposed to. And among among God's people, it was particularly important that they do. So, with that in mind, I struggle with this question. I'm just looking for your opinions. Who do we apply this lesson to that it makes God very unhappy when a society does not take care of those at the margins? How far do we apply this?
Probably worldwide. You probably find in every nation that people slip through the cracks.
Well, yeah, we've already established that. Does God get mad? Is he moved to judgment when it happens in Indonesia? Might. Very non-committal answer.
As far as this lesson goes, I think he's mostly focused on the Jewish people or the people in Israel.
So in terms of how it would apply today, who would be included in that?
I didn't hear what she said.
She said clearly it was a religious relationship. It was the Jewish people that were under consideration in this case. So if it's God's people who are under consideration here, how does that apply today? Who falls under the first layer here?
Everybody. Every nation, every...
Well, you may be right, but let's start with Donna's point. Obviously, it would continue to apply to the Jewish people, I think.
Right. That's what I think that's where he's going here.
Well, yeah, but I think if we speak of God's people, then I think we also have to include the church. In fact, probably primarily the church. So the church has, I think, a very clear responsibility to provide for, to care for, to meet the needs of people who are in the worst situations, people who cannot care for themselves. And I think certainly in United Methodism, that's been a hallmark of who we are. We haven't always done it perfectly, but I don't know that anybody does. But at least it's something we're aware of. I think the real question, though, for us needs to be, does God hold the rest of humanity to the same standard? And if so, is there a way to call the rest of humanity to account? Is there a way to get them to live up to that responsibility? At least in terms of the church's role in the world. You guys are all going,
I think he would.
You think God holds all of humanity to that same standard?
I mean, because he was, other countries here, he was, well, the church is supposed to go out and spread the word, to everyone. And those people that hear that, should be held accountable if they...
The people who don't hear it shouldn't be?
Well, I don't know. The whole world accountable to them?
Yes, but what do we do with that? What I love about this is you're sitting on the same razor I am. Let me tell you where I'm at right now, and just caution you to understand that I don't necessarily have the end-all be-all answer. I think it's quite clear that God holds all of humanity to the same standards, because that, in essence, is why there are those who are hellbound and those who are not, those who have responded to the call of Jesus and those who have not. Can we expect anything better from those who have not responded to Jesus? My answer is no, we cannot. Because my understanding as a Wesleyan Christian is the only way we can live holy and righteous lives is by the power of the Holy Spirit. We can't do it on our own. Therefore, it is unreasonable for us to expect any kind of behavior that is different from other societies. However, that does not absolve us from the responsibility to at least speak out on behalf of the voiceless, be the voice for the voiceless, and work to the best of our abilities to bring about changes that move in the direction of justice. I think sometimes, though, and maybe more often than not in our own denomination, we try to shift our purpose as the people of God to correcting those evils in place of the more uncomfortable and harder to celebrate piece of reaching people with the good news so that they might be changed themselves. It's a lot easier to speak out against an injustice, and then if it doesn't happen, well, no skin off my off me. And I'm being flip about that. I think most people who speak out really are passionate about it. But it's still, I think, easier to do that than to take the message of good news that God wants to change you so that you can be holy, so that you can live a righteous life, so that your life will be characterized by justice. That, in the end, is the only thing that's going to create a just society, is when a critical mass of people in that society have been transformed by the Holy Spirit. So you're kind of in this rocky situation. Where do I place the emphasis? Well, I think the emphasis always has to be on reaching those who don't know Jesus with the transforming message of grace.
Well, we can't really change them.
No, only God can.
Yeah, we can take the message to them, but it's still up to God and them whether the Holy Spirit's going to come into their life. Right?
Yes. But at the same time, knowing that, we do need to be the voice for the voiceless and expend effort in trying to minimize the oppression that is going on, even when the people who are in charge are not godly.
Just like when going into places like Haiti, where the government is bad, not treating people, missionaries go in there and help those.
Yes.
So that's what missionaries are doing. Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of mainline denominations have turned the missionary field into a social justice field. That is, the primary role of the missionaries is to bring that aid. I'm not sure that's what missionaries are supposed to be there for. I think it is a legitimate part of mission work. I don't think it should be the focal point of mission work. Some of it may be given the fact that Abraham Maslow gave us the hierarchy of needs, which is suspect in a couple of ways. But in the hierarchy of needs, you can't speak to a person about ultimate value if they haven't had any food in their belly. And so there's a sense in which many of us guide our lives based on that assumption, the pyramid that Maslow put together. Truthfully, though, I'm a student of Viktor Frankl, and I think a student of Jesus. I believe that if you have not satisfied the spiritual longing for meaning in your life, nothing else matters. And if you have, you can overcome, or you can live past, you can live heroically in the face of those negative circumstances, like I don't have enough food, I don't have any shelter, that kind of thing. There have been some remarkable people who have survived some pretty horrible circumstances simply because they knew their life mattered. It mattered to God and it mattered to others. Hey, Desmond Tutu just died. He had been imprisoned under apartheid. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, other people like that. You don't have to have your belly full to see the value in Jesus and to hear the call to God's transforming grace. But I suspect that quite often, much of what passes as missionary work nowadays is driven more by that Maslow's hierarchy kind of thing. I don't think we can solve this here tonight, but I want you to sense that what we're reading about, what we're learning about, has very real feet on the ground kind of implications for us. And the fact that we don't have a solid answer in place yet that everybody agrees on may indicate that this is a serious point of reflection. It may mean maybe the answer isn't so easy. And, each of us has to do a lot of careful soul searching and God praying and all that kind of stuff to come to an understanding of where we fit into this picture. Clearly, the church has a responsibility for the marginalized. But how much farther does it go? And what is the church's role? What is the individual Christian's role? I don't know that we have a solid answer yet. I'm in awe of people who think they do have the solid answer. Whether I agree with them or not, at least they have confidence.
There are people that have a lot to lose.
Speak to that. What do you mean?
The government has a lot to lose. The people in the government have a lot to lose. They have their nice little political careers. And I want to quote a Methodist minister, Emily Ellenberger, who had a similar discussion in the middle of Office Depot at State College. And Reverend Ellenberger said, Paul, if the government would get out of the road, and this might answer your question, the churches would take care of all the needs of the people. And so long as the government's in place, and they're not going to let go of it.
But what's interesting is, and I'm not saying I disagree because I actually, generally speaking, agree with that same line of thinking. But I think one of the things we have to take notice of is that even those in the government who make the strongest play in terms of trying to be the answer for the marginalized, they're really playing two sides of a priority coin, because in the end, they want to stay in office. And so the ones that they have to keep happy are not the poor. They don't have any pull. The ones that need to get happy are the ones that have the money to keep them in office. Which ultimately, I think, for me, is why government is not the answer to this. Yet, I think, from what we learn in Scripture, God does hold governments accountable among all the different things that we're held accountable for. But again, if you are lost, you're lost. So if a government official doesn't know Christ, they're already hellbound. How much worse can it be? should not then our first priority be to reach them with the good news of Jesus? Makes sense to me. There are people who it doesn't make sense for. Yes, would the church be the supreme example of social justice? Yes, I think it would be. Is the government in the way? In the United States, quite often. But I think, at this point, what we're speaking of is a more general sense and trying to understand our priorities. But what you said is part of the consideration. It's part of the thing you have to pull in. Is government best positioned and best equipped to do the kinds of things that we're talking about here? I don't think they are. Again, because in order to have a government position, you already have to compromise your values.
That's not right.
I didn't say it was right. I said that. No, it's absolutely wrong.
That's why we get in such messes, I think.
But the church is made up of two dramatically different philosophies when it comes to politics too. We've got people who think it's absolutely the government's responsibility, and we've got people who say, no, it's not at all. And then there are a few of us that sort of say, well, it really is kind of a middle-of-the-road thing. But if the church can't speak with one voice on it, how can we expect anything to happen? I don't know. It's a tough place to be. And yet it is a priority in God's heart and mind that we as people care for those that can't care for themselves.
Kind of makes you feel useless.
Well, helpless, I think is a better word. I don't feel useless, but I do feel helpless in the face of how big this problem is. And here I think we do need to take a little bit of comfort and encouragement from those that would put social justice ahead of evangelism, because they would tell you just because you feel helpless doesn't mean you shouldn't do something. And I think there's truth to that. We need to recognize that short of the coming of Christ the second time and the fulfillment of the kingdom, we're never going to be able to get this right perfectly. But we can do something in the direction of fixing it or helping with it.
Can I go back a little bit?
Please.
About the missionaries. So are we saying that there's not anybody out there troubling?
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the priorities seem to be a little bit lopsided. Maybe a lot.
I don't even have any idea how many missionaries are out there.
Well, I can only tell you what I remember from seminary. I don't think much has changed since then. If someone wants to correct me, they're more than welcome to. But the last I knew, the United Methodist Church had about 365 missionaries worldwide. We are the second largest Protestant denomination in this country. Presumably that would extend to the world. The only two groups that are bigger than we are would be the Catholics and the Southern Baptists. And we can only put 360 some odd people in the field? I think not. That's why there have been a lot of grassroots groups that have sent missionaries out in the name of a Wesleyan commitment, but without being authorized by the denomination. And we account for that in a lot of ways because of the state of the church, which we talked about in membership classes. It's a sad state. United Methodist women used to be a powerhouse when it came to sending missionaries out and supporting them. Was another thing that took a hit when we came together in 72 and started moving in the direction we're moving. United Methodist Women lost some of their focus a little bit at a time. I don't know. On the other hand, can we truthfully say that denominations that have sent thousands into the mission field are having much better success? I don't know. I know that some of the most hard-hit places in the world in terms of persecution of Christians are having the greatest growth in the church. One would have to assume that missionaries are involved in that, but in reality, what we know from the history of the church is that anytime there's a persecution, the church grows. And I think at the heart of it is the fact that if you're going to make a profession of faith when you're under persecution, it's a life or death situation. You're serious when you make that decision, and it will change your life. In our country, say you're a Christian, it doesn't affect anything. No, there's no danger to it, and there's no benefit to it, culturally. And there's no urgency. You know, when you're living on the edge of death because you're living in a place that can't produce enough food for your family, let alone for the whole society, there's a little more urgency to get right with God. So I don't know. But places like China and Malaysia and some other places like that, seeing tremendous growth in the Christian faith. And for United Methodists, Africa is growing by leaps and bounds. Well, one of the reasons that we're in the state we're in is because the last regular general conference that we had was sort of the last chance that the progressives would have to get their way, because the Africans are going to have more delegates progressively over the next few years, and we're going to lose delegates in the states. So they had to do something to bring things to a head. But because they will not accept defeat, they will not accept that they can't win, they've basically torpedoed the life of the church, forcing the rest of us to say, well, all right, we're going to have to leave then, because we can't live with that kind of disobedience to the order of the church. It's a sickness. Oh, what tangled webs we weave when first we practice. Why does God pronounce woe on Assyria when Assyria is simply doing what God is sending it to do? Remember we learned last week that Assyria is simply a tool in God's hands at this point. Assyria may not recognize it, but they're coming because God has put that in play.
That is surprising that you would have could influence a king or somebody that wasn't. I never saw that anywhere else. That thought.
Well, let's think about the logic of it for a second. If God is sovereign over all of creation, does it make sense that there would be any place in his creation that he could not influence?
I mean, that's true. But I just never thought he would use that on me to influence them to kill his own people.
Yep.
And then he gets it back.
I've said it a couple times in my preaching too, but it must not have hit you the way it hit you when you read it that way. And God makes course corrections by using the nations round about Israel. The nations are those that are not his people. And so sometimes he brings them into play whether they realize it or not.
But weren't the Assyrians, they were warriors to begin with, weren't they?
Well, yeah, there's no question that they were a rising power and they were bent on domination. But as we know from the beginning of Isaiah, God's been saying, look, if you trust me,
It'd be all right.
you're going to be fine. Because God has the power to keep them from laying waste to the promised land. It's not that he's moving the Assyrians to do something they would not normally have wanted to do. It's he's not going to stop them from doing it. He's going to take advantage of their warlike character. But that leads to the question that I'm asking. If they are a tool in God's hands, why then is he pronouncing woe on them? Why is he saying bad things are about to happen to Assyria?
Because the Assyrians think that they did it of their own accord.
Yes, there is a sense, they have the sense that this is all about them. It's about their power. And do you notice the idea of haughtiness in there? Once again, we're back to basic character flaws. And really, it goes back to the sin of the garden. Is this really about me? Well, the Assyrians couldn't think any other thing because they didn't know God. Surely, it must be their own power at work. And even if there's a divine influence, it's certainly not the influence of Israel's God, it's their gods that are influencing them for victory. Because it was taken for granted in the ancient world that if your country won a battle or a war, it was because your God defeated their God. Your God was more powerful than their God. Nothing else would make sense. So how in the world could the Assyrians come to the conclusion that Jerusalem, Israel's God, is causing them to do anything? No, it's their God that's causing them to do something. But they're full of themselves. They don't acknowledge God, and that is something that every human being is held to account for before God. The God of all creation will not play second fiddle.
I wonder if they knew about our God.
Not in any way that would have been meaningful. Their understanding would have been essentially the Jewish God was a false God. Or at most was just a lesser God. Because since the Assyrians were rising in power, their gods must have been the ones that count. You look like you were going to say something.
What's that?
You looked like you were about to say something.
Nope.
Okay. So, just to be clear that I think what we're seeing here is evidence that character matters to God. We don't need to put any qualifications on that. Character matters to God. The Assyrians, and particularly the Assyrian king, by wanting to take all the credit himself and not acknowledge that, this is divine intervention, or however you want to look at it, is no different than Joe Average or Josephine Average, who simply chooses not to acknowledge God in their day-to-day life, or goes to extremes and becomes evil, or whatever. It matters how we align ourselves in relationship with God, and that's about character. It even comes down to the question of submission, which we Americans don't like to deal with. We don't like that. And it's particularly true in the wake of the 60s and the movements like the feminist movement and liberation theology and stuff. We don't like the idea of submission because it means that I'm somehow less than I am, but it doesn't mean that. What it means is God is everything. We're all wrong when we don't submit. It's not that if I submit, someone else is going to get ahead of me. It's the only way it works is when God is God and we recognize that we ain't Him. The law of unintended consequences. We fight for certain things only to find ourselves in a worse pickle than we were before because of the consequences of what we fought for. We fought for independence, and our basic system of government is based on freedom, not equality, no matter what anybody tries to tell you. The fundamental value in our country is freedom, period, liberty. But because of that, we find it very hard to say, yeah, but we must submit to God and God's will. It doesn't matter when you're living, where you're living, or who you are. That is the bottom line when it comes to God. Are you in the right relationship with God, which is the relationship of submission?
We need to know when He wants that, when He wants us to submit.
No, that's not a question. It's always.
I mean, I don't know what I want to say.
No, wrestle with it because I'm not sure I'm tracking with you. You must have had something good there. What are you thinking?
Well, I was just... If something I'm not submitting to, I should be. Will He bring that to my attention?
Oh, well, that's a good question. And I think I want to go this way. It depends on whether you're a believer or not. If you're a believer, things I think are handled in a different way. If you are an unbeliever, you are already behind the eight ball. God loves you, and He's provided a way for you to get out from behind the eight ball, but you're already under judgment. The only place where this becomes an issue is if you're a believer and then you are consciously not submitting. Another way to talk about it is the way that we talk about sin sometimes. There are some Christians who say any disobedience of God, whether you know you did it or not, is a sin. Wesleyans look at it this way. A sin properly so-called, a sin that is properly called a sin, is a willful disobedience of a known law of God. So in other words, you had to know about it in the first place, and you had to disobey it intentionally. You're thumbing your nose at God. We come to that because in the Old Testament, especially in the book of Numbers, we find a distinction in the law between inadvertent sins and sin with a high hand. Inadvertent sin is I disobeyed God, but I didn't realize it, or I didn't realize it was a problem in the first place. Sin with a high hand is, neener, I'm not going to do what you say, God. Which one do you think counts? Remember, we have a God who is loving and just and is merciful and gracious and all that stuff. God's not going to unreasonably hold you accountable for something that you don't know.
It's like the little things and big things.
I think very quickly the big things ought to be, you ought to be able to assume you're going to know those. It's going to be little things that qualify, mostly. But then there's the question, like, this is kind of an easy example that really isn't easy. It's easy to come up with. Someone's about to harm your child, and you take up arms or your fists, and you remove the person from this good earth. Generally speaking, our courts acknowledge that as something that is reasonable based on the circumstances. It's justifiable homicide. I think we can also assume that God's going to look at that not as you willfully violated the commandment not to kill, but that you were led by a higher commitment in that situation. Can I say that? Absolutely? No. But that would be my take on it at this point in my life. However, if you adopt the attitude, well, I'll do it now and ask for forgiveness later, then we're talking about a different issue. But there was an example down in Texas not too long ago of a father who walked into the barn and found one of his hired hands raping his 8-year-old daughter. He did what I think any one of us would have done. He went ballistic and took the guy out. And I think shame on him if he hadn't, at least from a certain point of view. Because that was going to be permanent damage done to that innocent little girl who couldn't protect herself. Could he have stayed his hand? Sure. And maybe someone who's really, really been transformed by the Spirit and has been a Christian for a long time, maybe that person would. But I think God's going to look at that in a different way than he looks at, Kenny dropping a hammer on his wife's head. Oh, wait a minute, that happened, didn't it?
42 years ago.
42 years ago. The statute of limitations is probably up now.
Yeah.
But it wasn't intentional anyway. It slipped out of his hand. But you understand where I'm going with that. I think God, as a merciful God, is able to weigh circumstances too. At least I hope so.
So we wouldn't have time to take that thought about it.
Well, not in that moment, I don't think. At least his daughter's probably happy he didn't. So, one final question, and then I think we'll save the rest of this till next week. What does all of this say about God and God's expectations of humanity? We've started down this road already, but let's be real specific. What does it say about God that we can have this discussion about just 4 verses in Isaiah? What does it say about God? Another way to ask you is, what does it teach us about God?
Well, in the 10 Commandments, it says God is a jealous God, and if the Jewish people were not honoring him as they should, then he's not going to allow them to keep on.
So, does that make God
Judgment?
petty?
No. No, there's a difference between Dalton Kenny all the time because he's always, or if he actually goes and swaps one of my dogs. There's a difference. This is petty. This is mean.
Okay. All right. So it speaks in some ways to the jealousy of God for his own creation, his own creatures. Okay. What else? May, you've been very quiet.
I know I have.
And you're the only one in the field of view on the camera besides me, so you've got to say something wise.
Do you think he expects more of these people than they let him down?
I think that might be a good observation. I think that God does expect more from his people, and I think he does that in both covenants. Under the Old Covenant, he can reasonably expect more from his people because they have his will on paper. They know it. They have no excuse not to know it. Let's put it that way. And under the New Covenant, we have the Holy Spirit. So if we are living in some way that is unholy, we are quenching the Spirit of God given to us to help us do what we can't do on our own. I mean, how ridiculous is that? And yet we all do it, don't we? But yeah, I think he holds us to a higher standard, sure. And I don't think that's unreasonable. Well, that's a tough one. Because now all the fingers are pointing at me.
Well, like Gandhi said when he came to America in that when he was reading, he said, I don't know the exact quote, but I like your Jesus, but I don't like your Christians.
No, he said, I love your
I
Jesus.
love your Jesus, yeah. But I don't like
your Christians.
That's sad.
You go to my Facebook page under favorite quotes. That's my favorite quote.
It's always stuck with me. I don't know why.
Yeah, I would say that one of the biggest reasons that people refuse to acknowledge Jesus is because of Christians they've met. This sad commentary. In fact, I was just responding to a statement that somebody made on Facebook today about 2 hours ago. Made a blanket statement about all Christians being horrible bigots and stuff like that. I said, boy, you have a rather narrow picture of Christians, or narrow experience of Christians. And then I said, may God cause you to come into contact with some more Christ-like folks. But the reality is, most of us aren't Christ-like enough to be all that attractive. So, what is it we're doing? How are we presenting ourselves, and how are we trying to do a better job of it the next time? People who talk like that, they're responding to experiences they've had with people who profess faith.
I have a nephew that I don't want anything to do with the Bible or anything else. That's just a bunch of junk. He's very adamant about it.
Well, I'm going to remind you of this because I always need to be reminded of it too. Our job is not to introduce people to the Bible. Our job is not to introduce people to the creeds. Our job is not to introduce people to the church, to other Christians, or to anything like that. Our job is to introduce people to a person. Jesus.
You don't want to hear that either.
No, but it's a little harder to make impassioned arguments against a person. Because if you don't know him, how can you speak evil?
Yeah, he's never gone to church. I don't think he's ever picked up the Bible.
But he doesn't know Jesus. And you can know Jesus without ever picking up the Bible. Remember that in the first century, when they evangelized essentially the entire civilized world, which was the Roman Empire, they did it in a culture where less than 10% of the population could read and or write. That meant most people who were converted met Jesus some way other than in a book.
Mm-hmm.
So, anything else you want to say about what it teaches us about God?
He does forgive.
I'm not so sure that that's tucked in there, but it's certainly true. The thing that jumps at me is how this brings us back to the holiness of God, to the person, the essence, the character of God. If God were anything other than who he is, most of the stuff that he holds us accountable for would be meaningless. If God were like the other gods of the ancient Near East, which basically can be described with one word, capricious, they were random. They reacted differently based on which direction the wind was blowing that day. If God were like that, he could not be just in his holding us accountable. But because God is absolutely consistent in his righteousness, his character is never changing, and therefore righteousness is always the same. Because of that, God can hold us accountable to a standard, and that standard is himself. There's a reason, I think, that Isaiah likes the name Holy One or Holy One of Israel. And I think it's good reason for us to give that a higher place in our own understanding of God than most of us have done in the past. We started off with Sharon talking about God as Father, and that's all we have to have, essentially. No. I mean, you can live a faithful life and never consider to be God anything other than Father. But it better be a very good picture of Father. Because there's a lot that gets lost if all we do is think of Father the way most of us know fathers. I'll be very honest with you, I don't relate to God as Father. Not very well at all. I mean, I have the concept in my head. But I grew up in a very estrogen-heavy environment. I was the only male in that household. My dad was always at least 500 miles away from me while I was growing up. I did not have a consistent male role model. At this point in my life, I think I can say with some degree of confidence that I'm not sure if I'd had that consistent male role model that I would have ended up in a better understanding of Father, because my dad's not really the finest example of a father. Not to say he wasn't trying, but he's got some serious flaws. So I can't relate to God as Father. I used to say, and I think this is probably still largely true, I used to say that the best way I can relate to God is a shepherd. Because I'm a stubborn, wandering sheep, and I need someone with a good rod to smack me on the head from time to time. And someone to pull me out of the muck and mire that I find myself in all the time, and keep me from crossing the fence into dangerous territory. lead me to still waters. But it's important to have the Holy One in me. How did I get on that?